we look at the past, I would hope we can get inspired by looking at the craftsmanship and looking at the details and long to build better because we see beautiful things like this. So the last thing I want to talk about is the lost art of building is the metalwork and ironwork. And so I don't think there is a more expressive form of craftsmanship in America than ironwork, okay? Because, I mean, look at that, little cock's head, handle there. So these illustrations come from this three-part book called the Sewn Architecture Books, where they have gone back and documented and chronicled all these ancient ironworks and iron hardware. They're all charcoal drawn, pencil drawn things, so they're really beautiful. But the expressiveness of craftsmanship and form here, you don't see this kind of playfulness, you don't see this kind of fun that guys were having. So I love the ironwork and what it does. The most amazing part is the iron is where it starts in a swamp. Interesting, as I was reading out these things, they're saying that the ironwork expressed the melting pot of American design. Because you see German influences, you see French influences, you see English influences, all happening and all expressed in this hardware and where it is. So it starts with bog ore, that's a piece of bog ore. And basically, when they first came to America, apparently the American iron and bog ore was really good. And what is bog ore? So basically in swamps and things like that, iron will come out of the rocks and down and fall into the water, okay? It collects on the leaves of plants, and as the plants die, then that iron stays together. And they're saying in like 3 to 5 years, maybe 15 years, it will replenish. So if you go down and you pick up one of these bog ores, and this is basically iron in a very polluted sense, okay? Thank you, Alice. I'm excited about these books because you need to know about them. You can probably buy one in Dover, but if you could get this set, then it would be a lot of fun. But there's 3 volumes, and Sewn was the author, but you'll see that he basically chronicles, and he goes through and he tells you where this was, where it was found. This is a swordfish design that you'll see. But the creativity and the beauty of how these things are drawn, all chronicling kind of where they were made, how they were made, who made them. They're beautiful books, so you need to check those out. And they have gates, and they've got all the different hardware that we would see. So bog ore is a very polluted form of iron, and basically they will pull this up. The best iron in the world apparently was in Sweden because they had a lot of bogs, and that these bog ores would come out. What they do with that is then they put it into a very hot fire, and so they basically burn a lot of the impurities out of it. And once it gets down to some state, they convert it. There's 3 types. There's cast iron or pig iron, if you've ever heard that before. They basically melt it to a point, and it's not in a pure sense there. They'll pour it into a sand, they'll basically have a sand casted thing with all these little chutes like this, and this little nipple that comes out. And so they say it's like they're pouring it into here, and it goes down and it hardens in cast iron form right here. And these are called little piglets, right? Because you're pouring from the main pig down to the little piglets there. And so that's the cast iron. Now cast iron would be things like iron backs in the fireplaces and things like that. That would have been kind of the cast iron and how they would have used that. There's wrought iron. We'll talk about the wrought iron. That's a purer form, right? What they do is they actually, once they melt it down, it's in pig form. They take the thing and they reheat it back up, and they start to work it, okay, or wrought it, and it becomes wrought iron. And then later, Bessemer steel is where they blow really hot air through the steel. It takes a lot of the impurities out. That's how we have modern steel. And so those are the 3 types. The wrought iron, it bugs me because people say, I want a wrought iron fence. Well, no one really gets a wrought iron fence anymore. There's wrought iron, the verb, and wrought iron, the noun. Okay, so wrought iron is the thing, right? It's that purer form of cast iron that's been beaten and worked. Okay, there's actually grain in that wrought iron. If it's broken apart, you can see these fibers and grains going in it, and so that stuff is really good. It's like sourdough bread. You know how you have to keep a piece of it so that you can make your next piece of sourdough bread? That's kind of what wrought iron's like. What? My wife's yelling. I think she's saying shout out to Doug Bracken for helping me work through that. Is that it? No. Doug Bracken's my iron guy, and he talked me through what wrought iron versus wrought iron is. So when people say I want a wrought iron fence, what they mean is they just want an iron fence. And so to actually get true wrought iron, which is very rust resistant and a wonderful material that seems to be ageless, it's very difficult to get today. And so American iron is really good. Okay, so remember when we were still a colony, one of the rules about us is that you couldn't you could take raw materials, you had to send them back to England so they could be produced into something. So later we break that and we start to work our own iron and stuff like that. But they were taking Bogor back to, is one of the main shipping things that they were taking out of America at the time. So we'll start with architectural hardware. Realize that before they had this ironwork, early on, you might have a door with these. Those are wood hinges, okay? You had a wood latch. You might have a string that's how you lifted your latch, right? You might have a wood lock, okay? All those things were, if you didn't have them and you needed them, how would you do it? You'd make it out of wood, right? So those were the earliest things. You'll see also leather hinges where things are just kind of hung on a leather hinge and thrown together. Certainly didn't swing like a modern door would swing. And then, anyway, so a lot of it was wood. Now, iron, and I always used to think it was folklore. I don't think it is anymore, that they would burn houses to get the nails. Nails were incredibly expensive. And what they would do is once they got the wrought iron made, they would make it into nail rods, which are basically a 1/4-inch rod. And it was almost a home industry for some people where they'd get nail rod, and in the winter they'd make nails, right? And so nails were really expensive. They were all handmade. They were pointed. After you got the nail rod, they would point them, and then they would do what's called a rose head on top of them. But people were making nails by hand at this time. And so it's not until the 1820s, 1830s you begin to have cut nails. Nails are very expensive. Screws are almost non-existent, okay, because screws are something you have to make by hand. You have to actually file all those, that rotating deal into a screw. Imagine doing that. And so screws were very rare. So this hardware, as you'll see, here's what a forge would look like, were, held on with nails, right? So they would nail them to the door, nail them onto the face of the thing, and very few of these things were screwed. I think I talked to you about cinch nails before, how they would drive a nail through and then turn it back on itself and cinch it together. It's how they kind of locked things together. The progression of hinges is that you've got strap hinges, mid-18th century. Next are H and L hinges. Now I've got one of my other iron companies that does ironwork, Heritage Metalworks. They make a lot of this stuff, and we've used this on jobs. But you begin to see these are strap hinges, right? The variety of decoration at the end of these little strap hinges is immense. But you see a bunch of different hinges here. This is an H hinge. An H and L hinge would be a hinge that went down and goes left, and we'll show you some of those in a sec. They become more popular. This kind of thing is called a rat tail hinge. This would have been used for cabinetry. And so this is a butterfly hinge or a dovetail hinge. So these were all the kind of things that were made and all secured with nails, not screws, the way things were made. This too, you'll see some variety in here on the locks as well. And the different lift handles, they did the different finishes. This was a lock, actually a very crude spring. See that? That's actually your spring, and it's actually how you open this. This is called an open face lock. There's another one on that door back there. That door in that frame right there is held in there with H hinges. And so that's kind of a typical arrangement of how that would have been done. And what you see is that there's this kind of bell curve where at first to have hinges would have been a sign of wealth, okay? And then as time goes on, having iron hinges was a sign that you were poor, and so they would want brass hinges and different and hidden hinges as time goes on. This would be some typical arrangements of how they would secure a door, how they would keep a door true. The way these doors were hung is literally that there was a pintail that was driven into the frame, and then these doors, these strap hinges are hung on that pintail, set inside that door, then they would have nailed it to that door, or they would have put it on there and then set it up there and put the pintail in. So, but those were, hanging on very crude rods. Here's some of the pictures of the variety. They had bifold doors at this time, believe it or not. But the variety and ingenuity and expressiveness of these different hinges, I think, is awesome. These are called cock's head hinges here. See the little cock's head up there? And they would face in and out. These are the rat tail hinges I was talking about. And here's some rat tail hinges we used on a job in South Carolina. That was a fun job. And then as they started wanting to hide these things, they would, if you see that H hinge back there, instead of having the H hinge exposed on that piece of trim, they would hide it behind the trim. So the trim would go over that one side of that H, and they began to hide them. You see here, they put them in the edge of the door. And so it was a sign of kind of wealth and that they didn't want crude looking hinges. And then by 1830, 1850, they have cast butt hinges. Again, screws are very expensive. This was nailed in, right? So it's not until 1850, 60, 70 that you begin to see machine-made screws. The lashes sometimes were wood. Okay, this is one that has some metal surrounds. These rim locks, and I've got some examples here that you're welcome to come look at. One of the things that's interesting to me is it's a pretty thin metal. It's not real heavy. I'll pass these around. This is an European one. This is an American one, and you see how that's made. This is really cool example that shows kind of the texture and the feel of these plates and how they were nailed together or pinned and wedged together. So it's pretty awesome how they did this. Brass was really expensive. And so literally the way they would lay out a house is that on the entry you might see brass, and then going into a formal room you might see brass, but nowhere else in the house. And so brass was something that was just very expensive. Obviously a brass rim lock here with the job we did with a stirrup handle. So it wasn't always a knob, it was different kinds of handles and rings. But that's the kind of the progression where you have, string lock pushes, you have the iron, the Suffolk locks was what I was just showing you. Open face locks, and then rim locks. Basically it's an open face lock with a cover on top of it with springs, and then the use of brass and iron. I think I went the wrong way. No. So again, here's that swordfish design I was telling you about. I was showing you that book, top and bottom. But again, just kind of fun, expressive ways for a blacksmith to create and show off his art. Called a Norfolk lock. When they have this flat plate, oftentimes it's machine made, or most of our hardware in early America was brought in from England. And so it wasn't until we got rid of that, the rule, being a British colony, we couldn't make anything here, that we started making our own stuff. But you'll see this wide variety of open face locks, basically a spring holding these latches down so that it would open and close. Very ingenious and certainly a lot of fun. As far as gates and railings, the things like this, it's in some of the books are saying you see a lot more railing and that kind of work in New Orleans and Savannah and Charleston than you do in, say, Boston. There's just more of it down south. Philadelphia was pretty good. Maryland, there was some good stuff. But a lot of it happens in New Orleans and Charleston. If you've been to Charleston, you've seen the beautiful stuff. And they would do a mix of wrought iron and cast iron. So little bells or little medallions and stuff like that would be cast. Everything else would be wrought. Notice the decoration, the lyre, the harp inside these designs that you see, which was common, very expressive, very beautiful. There's that church at St. Michael's Church in South Carolina. Obviously an urn detail here, which is really wonderful. Cast medallions on these corners. But that's been there 250 years, out exposed like that. Speaks to the quality of the wrought iron. I think that would have rotted by now if that was steel. But that early wrought iron was amazing stuff. I'm not an ironwork expert. I just have a huge appreciation of it. There's a thing called repoussé. Repoussé is if you saw my video that we did on the build show on that house in the stairway, this little leaf, the little water leaf detail here is repoussé. And basically what they would do is this was all wrought and welded and made together. But then these pieces are hand hammered. And so you see it here where this leaf comes off and all this dainty stuff here is repoussé. And it's a way of, it's very French, right? That's always a French word, but it's a way of expressing a little bit more, of giving this a little bit more life, that you actually have a leaf that kind of flips around and changes. So it's quite wonderful. And when you think of cast iron, I think of, ranch houses with the railings around the entry of the house. But cast, this is 1850s, I think, in South Carolina. This is all cast iron here, all these pieces are. And as you go further away from that 1820, early era, you get away from the wrought iron and most of the stuff begins to be cast iron. This is a beautiful example of wrought and cast iron. But the beautiful arrows and and that's just such a pretty design. But a combination of cast and wrought, mostly wrought after that time. And then of course New Orleans, where you're so used to seeing this down in the French Quarter. A lot of this is cast, a lot of it has been replaced, but still very beautiful and typical in that era. And then final slide here, just kind of the magic in Charleston. And then, these are shutter dogs. These are for the shutters. Basically, when the shutter opens against the wall, this shutter dog is weighted, like this end of it weighs more than this. So it always falls down and stands up, right? And I have to say, this is a public service announcement. Because it drives me crazy when people have a shutter on their house and here's their shutter and they've got the shutter dog up here. Drives me nuts, okay? And you see it wedged in there so it'll stay there, because it won't stay there, right? It wants to fall down straight. That shutter dog goes right here, okay? And the bottom portion of it is weighted so that it holds the shutter so the shutter can't blow open, okay? So this was a public service announcement. That's why this end's longer than this end. That's why this weighs more than this, so that there could be weighted and so that it can hold the shutter open using gravity, and it therefore lasts longer. So that's my public service announcement.